してください。オポジション側、ファースト、セカンド、サード、ガバメント側、ファースト、セカンド、サードです。お願いします。これはこのマイク回して使います。はい、ファースト、セカンド、サード。じゃあ最初にオポジションにマイク入れっぱなしでいいです。でポイントの時は必ず立ってください。お読み込めるポイントに立って、どんなポーズでもいいです。自分の好きなポーズ。それいいですね。モデルですからね。で、ガバメントだよ。モーションってまだみんな知らない。
選手紹介した後に。
あ、オッケーオッケー。楽しみだよ。いろいろありがとう。いちいちこういうマイク回します。これはね、これが必ずカットになります。
モデルディベートについてオーディエンスの皆様にいくつか連絡があります。まずこのモデルディベートはアジアンスタイルの5554となります。ウィップスキーパーも含みます。そしてこの対決の決断はオーディエンスの皆様に任せます。つまりオーディエンスボートです。よって選手の皆様および顧問の皆様には、モデルディベートをしっかり聞いてもらって勝敗をつけておいてください。
もう一点すみません、連絡事項になります。この試合、選手に確認して、録画録音 OK ってなりましたので、すみません、先ほどダメだって言ったんですけど、別に公式も撮りますけど、撮りたい方は録音、録画しても OK となりましたので、よろしくお願いします。
あ、そうね、モデルディベーターの方がいいよということなんで、ね、よろしくお願いします。じゃあ
それではモデルディベートの時間になりましたので始めたいと思います。It's now time for the model debate. Everyone, please take a seat and settle down. I would first like to introduce our model debate speakers for today. Starting from government side, speaking for Prime Minister is Mitsushi Ono, Hpdu Chief Coach. He is also 35-time champion, has 35 championships and is the WUDC ESL quarterfinalist. Everybody, please have a round of applause for Mitsushi Ono. Second speaker of government side is Natsuki Mogi, who is... Second speaker for government side is Kotaro Yoshida, who mastered in law at U Tokyo, is a WUDC Open quarterfinalist and the champion for Oxford IB. Everyone, please give a round of applause to him. Third speaker is Natsuki Mogi, who is the Hpdu 2024 Best Speaker, WSDC Team Japan for 2023 to 2025. Everyone, please give a round of applause to Natsuki Mogi. And finally, for the reply, we have again Kotaro Yoshida. Thank you. On opposition side, speaking for first speaker is Hiroko Sugano, who is Team Japan for WSDC 2024 and 2025, and is the champion and best speaker for Hpdu 2025, and also has the Minister of Education Award at PDA. Everyone, please give a round of applause. Second speaker for opposition side is Seiji Kanegai, who is the WSDC EFL 4th Best Speaker, WSDC Team Japan for 2023 to 2025, and for the last 2 years has been captain, and is also the Hpdu Champion and Best Speaker of 2024. Everyone, please give a round of applause to Seiji Kanegai. Last but certainly not least is Nasa Tsuchiya, who is the WUDC Open quarterfinalist and top 10 speaker, is Oxford IB champion and overall best speaker, and also graduated with a master's degree at U Tokyo. Everybody please give a round of applause. also for the reply speaker of opposition side, we have again Seiji Kanegai. Today's motion is the finals motion from last year's Hpdu competition, which is, this house believes that globalism has failed the working class. This house believes that globalism has failed the working class. Info. Globalism refers to the ideology, politics, and systems that foster global interconnectedness and independence, often linked to economic, political, and cultural integration. Are both teams ready? Then, without further ado, we call upon the Prime Minister to kick off the debate. Hear, hear.
Can you hear me?
Okay.
Can you hear me? Okay. Thank you. Donald Trump ran his campaign with the slogan, "Make America Great Again." A lot of people dismissed it as a political rhetoric, but we need to ask, why did the message so strongly resonate with a lot of people in the working class? Because globalization has brought insecurity, economic insecurity, unstable employment rather than economic growth. That is why we think this motion must stand. We would like to give you two arguments from a side of proposition. One, reduction of economic security in advanced nations. My partner is going to talk about the impact of developing countries. Before moving on to argumentation, let me just briefly define the motion, what we are debating. So, how do we measure has failed this term? We think this failure is a situation in which we don't meet a certain ideal goal or objective. The motion requires us, debaters, to adjudicate whether the situation is equivalent with that set standard and situation. Hence, we don't necessarily talk about counterfactual that would have been materialized otherwise. And secondly, what is ideal objective of globalism? We are not going to give you a perfect definition of globalization and globalism. That's going to be a PhD thesis, but I only have 5 minutes here. But there are several relevant features that this ideology, globalism, is trying to achieve. Firstly, we assume multinational corporations globally operate business, establish factories and subsidiaries in developing nations, while headquarters are usually located in the first world. Ideally, people around the globe have a job. And secondly, ideally, free trade is accepted widely, which means that importation and exportation of goods with relatively lower tariffs and free trade and free flow of capital, i.e. foreign direct investment, or movement of labor, i.e. immigration and migration are widely accepted. Ideally, people access to cheaper goods. We think globalism has failed in these criteria. Moving on to my first argument, reduction of economic security. The thesis of this argument is that globalism sacrificed stable employment and income security in exchange for cheaper consumer goods, the situation of which exacerbated living standard of laborers. There are 3 logics to support this thesis. Number 1, stable jobs were systematically eliminated. Globalism encouraged multinational corporations to relocate their production to lower-wage countries. This disproportionately affected unionized manufacturing and long-term full-time employment and predictable career path. On logic number 2, income volatility increased. Fired workers now have no transferable skill. Workers are pushed into some sector with relatively lower wages and non-regular employment and short-term contract without any benefit. Logic number 3, the bargaining power of laborers and labor union was drastically reduced because multinational corporations can relocate business anytime, anywhere, but workers remain tied to their family, local community, and housing. They can't move around. As a result of that, as a result of loss of political influence, states now cannot legislate policies to deal with inflation, the rise of housing prices. You know what? Foreign capital buy out lands and jack up the price, and the price of property is going up and up. The price of goods are going up and up in countries like the United States and Japan. Let me give you several examples to support these analyses. In the United States, automobile companies such as General Motors or Ford close the factories in Midwest like Detroit and relocate the production to Mexico. Now, NAFTA, free trade, North American free trade agreement, encouraged such an outsourcing or offshoring trend into other industries as well. Imagine workers in, let's say, Detroit had been working in the same factory for over 30 years. Now he's in 40s or 50s. He is not able to find a next job because he has no other transferable skill. If one factory is shut down, hundreds, thousands of people, laborers face this kind of situation. The situation is now called structural unemployment. How do you deal with this crisis? Before moving on to impact, any point? Go.
What is the ideas of globalism and why are you there to define it?
I think that's what I have been talking about for 4 minutes and 30 seconds. But please, if you have any counter narrative, I'm happy to hear that in the rest of your speech. Moving on to the impact. So why is this argument important and debate winning? First of all, time frame, very classical debate criteria. We understand that globalism temporarily creates jobs in India, Pakistan, or Southeast Asia, but that's raised to the bottom because those jobs will be eventually replaced with cheaper labor countries like African countries, while our job insecurity is systematically and permanently entrenched, therefore long-lasting harm. Moreover, fundamentality. We know cheaper goods are good, but if you don't have a stable income, job security, you cannot buy anything. We think job security are prerequisite to cheaper goods or any marriage that they would talk about in this debate. We are happy to propose. Thank you.
Thank you for your fine speech, Prime Minister. Now I call upon the Leader of Opposition to give his or her speech within 5 minutes. Hear, hear. Just so the debaters are aware, we will clap our hands twice at the 5-minute mark and 3 times at the 5:15 mark.
Okay.
The reason why families in Ghana have access to clean water is because European countries rely on Ghana for its uranium industry. Clean water in Ghana means uranium and electricity for Germany and France, which is why Germany and France are incentivized to invest in Ghana. We believe that the working class in the poorest of countries, of which they are the most working class, benefit hugely from globalism, which is why we support interconnectedness and interreliance. With that then, I would like to go into my speech. My first argument will be on economic stability for developing countries, and my second argument will be overall improvement in the quality of life for all working class people. But before that, I have a few pieces of rebuttal. Firstly, I would like to rebut and do a framing challenge. They said that if we do not meet that standard, that 3 standards on globalism, we basically have failed the working class. However, I want to point out that globalism is just a word, and there is no set definition by any international organization on what it is. Meaning that even if we fail to meet these standards, if we are able to prove that globalism has benefited the working class more than it has harmed them, we think that we are still able to win this debate. We think that that counterfactual that they have to defend, in which we are trying to say the counterfactual is harmful, is a kind of counterfactual in which developing countries are sustained within their own domestic country and have to make money within that economy, or have to rely on bilateral trade with nearby countries. We think that that is pre-globalism, pre-United Nations, like pre-World War II kind of world that they have to protect. With that then, I would like to go into 2 refutations to that first case. They said that MNCs relocate abroad to developing countries, which harms countries like the US. A, we think that this is not that bad for developed countries, right? We think that in developed countries like the US, you basically have compulsory education, and you can basically, most people in these countries go to college, guys. So we think that if you at least get an engineering degree, or if you do get an agriculture degree, you can cross-apply it to different sectors. So we think that they do have transferable skills. But B, I have to point out here that it's not necessarily a bad thing overall. Even if the number of jobs decreases in the United States, it increases for the working class in Pakistan. US, which is why they still have a burden of proof there. With that then, I would like to go into my first argument on economic stability for developing countries. I want to point out that developing countries are where a majority of this context takes place in, because 95% of these people are poor, working class people. We think that globalism is better for two reasons. A, there's more foreign investment, and by foreign investment, we mean like multinational corporations, right? We think that these MNCs are uniquely incentivized to contribute to other countries, because contributing to other countries, like supply chain systems, directly benefits you, because you can get resources, you can get uranium from them. I gave you an example in my introduction, let me give you other examples. For example, it looks like Panasonic in Japan investing in educating Vietnamese factory workers so that these Vietnamese factory workers can produce steel for Panasonic. So we think that these Vietnamese workers are able to get a job, they're able to get an education. But this also looks like just jobs in African countries, right? They have more choice in jobs, so you don't have to just become a farmer. You can actually go and have other job choices, such as becoming a factory worker that will be more high-paying than your own domestic economy. I want to point out that these MNCs are less predatory or less exploitative when there is globalism, because when there is globalism, there are more companies competing to be in your country, which means that at the point in which there is the World Bank, IMF, like competing against China's BRI, that is at the point at which you're incentivized to provide them with good labor conditions, so that these countries will accept you into that country. In the counterfactual, we think that there's basically no investment whatsoever, or even if there was investment, it's exploitative because there's little competition. Second, I want to talk about exports. We think that countries like Middle Eastern countries, whose 90% of the economy relies on exporting oil to Europe, are basically diminished when there is no globalism. Because Middle Eastern countries can only export to their neighboring countries, of which there are few, but also their neighboring countries have the same resources as them, which means that there is very little customer base. The impact of this is that, no thank you, the impact of this is that you can basically get more export choices and therefore more money for the working class people. My second argument, I'll go very briefly on this, is that the quality of life of people just simply increases. Firstly, because there is more innovation, because there is more competition. Globalization means that you're constantly competing with companies from other countries to gain a global audience, which means that is why for COVID-19 there was like innovation in things like AstraZeneca from the UK, Pfizer from Germany, Sputnik V from Russia, because everyone's competing to want to get to the global audience. For all these reasons, Sir Pat stand on side opposition today. Thank you.
Thank you for your fine speech, Leader of Opposition. Now I call upon Member of Government to give his or her speech within 5 minutes. Here.
If any member of government bench was a doctor and the patient had a heart disease, and turns out that you conduct surgery to them, turns out that the heart disease is gone, but now you have a massive side effect in the form of lung cancer, they're going to call it the counterfactual debate. They're going to compare the state where other doctors have conducted surgery and say other doctors were much worse, therefore this is a benefit. That's not how you conceptualize whether something has failed or something has, succeeded. In many cases, if there is a substantial harm arising from a certain phenomena, we consider it a failure. The fact that you have a side effect means that it is a failure. There is no need to compare the counterfactual, whatever the boring debate word that is. The first thing I'm going to ask in this debate is how do we measure success? And secondly, I'm going to talk about the impact to developing countries. Firstly, how do we measure success? Because they say globalism is just a word. No, it's an ideology. Google them. People like Francis Fukuyama in the early 2000s, in the book called The End of History, literally said that how globalized world is going to be a utopia. A lot of writers and authors in Washington Post, despite being one of the most conservative leaning media outlets in America, so literally suggested a constitutional amendment to open borders in America. These are the prominent advocates for globalism that has historically existed. And for these people envision a world where the global wealth is going to be spread to not just people in developing countries, but also people to the developed countries as well. People who are working in the car manufacturing sector in Detroit, and all of those people. Therefore, that was the intended purpose of globalism, and globalism has clearly failed to meet that standard. Go ahead.
When so many different people create different definitions of globalism, how can you be the single most authority on the definition that we all follow?
Because Google said so. And because because that's what the most people conceptualize as globalism is, right? Like, you can't define if that's the definition, like, you cannot define anything, right? Because everyone has different conceptions of everything. At some point, you have to determine the social definition of what constitutes an ideology. Everyone has different takes. That's not a good enough reason. All right. Impact on developing countries. The starting point for this argument is just to explain that there is a massive difference in the negotiation power between people in developing countries versus the multinational companies, for the relatively simple reason. Multinational companies are super rich, super lucrative, they have all the money in the world, but there are lots of developing countries in the world that are competing against each other to lure in factories, for example. And what that meant was that a lot of the times there was little wage, little compensation provided to workers in developing countries, and often they were forced into a dangerous factory job where the risk of injury is really high. What if you get injured, you don't get compensation, and you lose your limb? At the worst instances, you cannot get any compensation, but then your family has to, bear the cost of medical treatment, for example. A lot of the times, a lot of workers in developing countries were overworked, they were sleep deprived, they were depressed to the last minute of their lives. It is not a benefit in and of itself. They say you create jobs in Pakistan. Good for you, but the job is massively tiring and massively physically traumatizing. It is rather a harm in this debate. But secondly, I would note that the many households sent workers to the urban area to make sure that they're part of the factory job, for instance. But that was an active harm, because a lot of the times these factory jobs did not generate enough income for the families. But what about the families back home? What about farmers, right, in rural area? These farmers did not have enough manpower in their back home. So what happened is that their families are the ones that take enormous amount of suffering. If the climate condition is bad, they don't have enough manpower to be able to harvest any produces. So that's how a lot of the structural inequality was created in developing countries. It was rather a harm than a benefit. But secondly, in addition to all of this, I would note that there's an internal hierarchy of power in developing countries. So what I mean by this is that who got rich in India when the economic growth of India was at all points high? It was the Adani, who is the local oligarch, one of the closest friends of Modi. It is not a random farmer in Punjab that benefits from the economic growth in developing countries. Rather, it is the local elites. It is the urban elites. It is people who already have closer connection with the powerful people in the government that gets enormous amount of government contracts as well as signing with multinational companies. But these people are nowhere near the vulnerable working class that we're talking about. These people, in fact, were already oligarchs and rich people. So these people might benefit, but the vast majority of working class were forced onto a very cheap, low compensating job with little benefits but more of the risk. Finally, I would suggest there is a massive social harms in developing countries. Look at the massive environmental destruction that we see around the world, where local water is polluted by the oil companies, where the air pollution is caused by multinational, international factories, where the property developers bulldoze into indigenous lands in Brazil, for example. All of those uniquely happen because of the internationalization of the economies. So, at the end of this debate, what you should adjudicate on is that people who are working in car manufacturing in Detroit were a vulnerable working class citizens, and that we should care about them. Very proud to stand for competition.
Thank you for your fine speech, Member of Government. Now I call upon the Deputy Leader of Opposition to give his or her speech within 5 minutes. Here.
I think proposition tries to push an extremely lame debate for us to have. Because their idea of what this debate should be is that this perfect definition of what globalism as an ideology should be has to be entirely met by the current world for us to be able to win the debate. Like, disregarding all of these small mechanistical wrongs that the second speaker provides and their reason to why they think this is the correct definition, like, consider how stupid a debate about this would be. About how if we can't fit every single small definition of an ideology, that we have completely failed the ideology itself. Obviously, as long as this ideology, for example, brings water to the people of Gabon, or for example, brings jobs to the people in Pakistan, then we can say that globalism has created net benefit to society, that globalism has not failed us, and that it has brought us benefit. So to prove that important practical clash to you, 2 ways I'm going to do that. First, I'm going to deal with the far less important clash in this debate about developed economies, then on the more important clash about developing economies. First, on the developed economy, the proposition line of argument poses that because of the multinational corporations that are able to relocate production, that people lose jobs, that this loss of job is harmful due to the lack of transferable skills, and that things like labor unions lose power. I'm going to respond to this line of argument in 2 ways. First, this is just structurally untrue. Although it is true that the manufacturing industry in, for example, the US is being largely relocated to other countries, this is inherently being replaced by other industries, and that is why, for example, the US government is somewhat was willing to let these companies, for example, leave. When we look at, for example, the US, even though automobile production has gone down, we have increased the programming of the AI that, for example, creates self-driving cars. And this job replacement has happened, which means even if numerically we have less manufacturing jobs, we increase other important jobs anyway. Crucially, I think their first speaker is wrong in saying that a lot of the times these people who are currently in manufacturing jobs have to transfer to lower paid service work jobs. Like, by definition, and if you look around you, manufacturing jobs just tend to be less paid than is a surface worker. Like, if you work at a kombini, you are probably a little bit better paid than if you spend your days creating automobiles in a factory. Crucially, even if you don't take these mechanisms, I think that our second argument about the quality of life increase that happens to people weighs over their line of argument. First of all, our second argument proved innovation. But our second argument also has a second mechanism about the ability to import. That is, in the dried up rural areas of Africa, we can now import fertilizers from other areas due to globalism, which allows us to create crops. Or in a country that cannot produce insulin, we can now uniquely import insulin from Canadian companies who are able to produce them. So simple necessities, ranging from simple necessities and to luxuries, we are now able to import these things. Crucially, why does the innovation and importing 2 mechanisms weigh above their first argument about the loss of jobs? 2 reasons. 1, on the level of uniqueness. Because if your country has no insulin, you have no choice but to import it, and globalism was the only way to do that. But joblessness has other solutions. Just move, or get government welfare, or go to a different sector. Joblessness is tackleable. It is being tackled. But for the child in Africa who has no fly net and are fighting malaria, the only choice is to import it from India because that is the only country that produces it. And that's the only thing that is the unique impact of globalism. The second reason why we win is on the extent of harm, because the proposition's harms are so easily mitigated. Like, by nature of being a developed country, you are able to do things like mitigate joblessness by, for example, taxing the rich more and redistributing that wealth to the poorer countries. Crucially, the problem with PM is they focus entirely on the developed countries, which are the exact countries who are best able to deal with joblessness. More important question on the developing economy. The proposition case hinges on this idea that this lack of bargaining power creates a few harms. Our response will not contest the lack of bargaining power, maybe my whip is better at debating than me and will do that, but rather to contest the downstream impacts of this. First, the idea that there will be a loss of manpower in important sectors like farming. Crucially, like, people aren't dumb. If your family's entire economy depends upon farming, then you're probably not going to give all of that up for the hope that maybe you get employed. So individuals can make rational calculuses about whether a choice to take a job would be good for them. The other mechanism we get is this idea that wealth concentrates to the hyper-rich. But money actually does trickle down. First of all, because the people on the ground need it. For example, you can't have your workers dying of lack of water, so obviously you give them water. But also secondly, because we can build infrastructure, like roads and wells are not unique to just the rich, and this will benefit all the people of the country. We benefit the developing economy, that is the important impact. Proud to oppose.
Thank you for your fine speech, Deputy Leader of Opposition. Now I call upon Government Whip Speaker to give his or her speech within 5 minutes. Here.
This debate is not about abstract gains of GDP, nor is it about consumers who benefit from slightly cheaper goods. This debate is about those who do not appear in success stories, the voiceless in developed economies, those individuals who had to lose their only source of income in the Rust Belt in America. These are the individuals that we support on our side of the house. DLO says, oh, just move and get jobs. But frankly speaking, this is offensive to the millions of individuals who went through multiple interviews and had rejected. We think that those individuals matter more. I'll chat about two things. Firstly, on developed economies, and secondly, on developing countries. But before that, I do want to talk about the definition of what failure means. This wasn't an attempt from our world about a technical definition of what failure or globalism looks like. It was about how the most individuals conceptualized globalism in the past as a promise, as an expectation that it would bring about benefits more than they have brought in status quo. And hence, the fact that it wasn't able to meet that promise that most individuals have already anticipated in the past means to you that this is a failure. But disregarding that, we will engage with their definition as well. First theme then, let's chat about developed country. Our claim was simple. Our claim was about the economic security of those individuals who are the most vulnerable. And towards which they just give us one response, which is to say relocation of jobs created new important jobs as well. Two responses. Firstly, judge and audience, look at your flow. There was no explanation whatsoever coming from DLO as to how this correlates with the globalization to begin with. Yes, the number of jobs has increased in the past 50 years, but that's just because the globalization was also happening in that past 50 years. No explanation whatsoever why, in that counterfactual world, that wouldn't have happened. Second of all, 50 years old who worked in manufacturing laborers, who are the actor that we wanted to talk about, are presumably unlikely able to move to a new, different service sector. And the structural reason for this, which we provided from Mitsushi's speech, which just literally gets no response to, is the fact that these individuals have no transferable skills, and these individuals literally have not been trained and working in different sector, all of which got just dropped from opposition side of the house. But the last thing they say is that you just cannot import on our side of the house. But the simple fact here is that the most necessities that you need, either in developing countries or developed countries, can be created in your country. Like for example, it being food, or for example, it being, let's say, your infrastructural projects. And let's say you aren't able to import specific, let's say, egg. It's unclear to me what that does to the debate. It's unclear why this is a fundamental debate winning point coming from opposition. Before I move on to weighing, sure.
The influx of alternate jobs need not to be caused by globalization. Even if by coincidence it happened, you still have no harm.
Okay, I don't know what that does to the debate, because if you are trying to win on alternate jobs, you are the one who need to prove why uniquely that only happens on your side. No explanation there. On weighing, they say individuals in developing countries are more vulnerable, but I want to note there's no moral distinction between individuals that live in developing countries that are vulnerable and those who are living in the Rust Belt who just cannot get transferred. Therefore, on vulnerability, that's not a magic bullet they can win on. Secondly, in terms of number, they give a fake data that 95% of the individuals living in developing countries, that's a factual unreality. I.e., we think that significantly more individuals than they have anticipated do live in developed countries, and these individuals do matter as well. And our weighing mechanism is the extent and the value of jobs that these individuals get or lose. Because our second speaker already explains that the individuals who do get jobs in developing countries do live a harsh reality where they are just used as in an exploitative process, which is literally slavery, as opposed to the dignified jobs that you do lose in developed countries, which is worth consideration in this debate. Quickly, let's talk about developing countries. The first thing I want to do is to explain why their only benefits only apply to the elites in rural areas and does not trickle down to the most vulnerable individuals they say is important. Seiji explains that people need things like water and therefore it does trickle down. But this is not logic, right? Just because individuals do need it does not mean that the MNCs and the individuals who are in positions of power have a good incentive to provide you with good healthcare. And the reason why this is not possible, firstly, in terms of an incentive level, multinational corporations are profit incentivized and do things like jack up prices. Secondly, in terms of capacity, oftentimes multinational corporations do create power asymmetry, which is why they oftentimes, get things like concessions from those governments, which is why I think these comparisons do work. Therefore, I think the benefits that they enshrine is unlikely to trickle down to the most vulnerable individuals that live in developing countries. But even if we don't take that, we would suggest that working as a farmer in an agricultural suburban area is in fact far better than they have proposed. Firstly, because you still have dignity, right? I.e., even if you don't have that much money, you living in a suburban area in Bangladesh must have been better than the globalization that we think proceeds in their world. For all of those reasons, proposition cleanly takes this debate.
Thank you for your fine speech, Government Whip Speaker. Now I call upon Opposition Whip to make their speech within 5 minutes. Here.
Three things in my speech. Firstly, on developing countries, secondly, on developed countries, and thirdly, on access to goods and services. Firstly, on developing countries, I just want to note that they don't actually engage to our argument, which is that this globalization is the unique incentive for countries to invest in other countries, whether it be through things like MNCs, or whether it be through things like country-on-country investment, things like IMF or World Bank, for example. This is critical, because this is the only way these countries have enough money to be able to invest in infrastructure, to be able to create things like water for people on the ground, to be able to create things like jobs for people on the ground. Notice that they give zero response to this. Let's look at their case. Their case is twofold. The first thing they say is that working conditions for these people are bad, and therefore it's bad that these people have jobs. There's three responses here. The first thing is that the comparative is that these people are confined to back-breaking labor in the fields, in the hot fields outside, in the rural areas of their agricultural, ancestry fields that they have, for example, right? What we afforded on our side is choice. These people can now choose to move to urban areas and take up these jobs. These people can choose to now maybe send their child to an education center because they can accumulate, money from working in these factories, for example. Obviously, we're not saying you have to work in a factory. The choice is uniquely given on our side. That is obviously better for these people at the end. The second thing here is that at many times the comparative is not that you can just farm all day, all night. It is that many times these people do not have this type of job security into the long term. Maybe it's because things like droughts hit, meaning that your farm cannot farm any more crops, and therefore you lose your job, for example. Maybe it's because your job is taken up by some other better, automation that happens, mean that you can't work as a farmer, for example. But there's many reasons why a person might lose a job when the economy of the country is extremely monocultural. On our side, House, this investment that's uniquely created through globalization diversified many of these economies, allowing people to have security nets outside of this one line of job through agriculture. This is probably good than not having any job at all. Maybe if it's really, really bad, really, really hard job, I think many people will prefer that over not having any food on the table because they cannot have a job at all. But the last thing I just want to note is that I don't think these jobs are as bad as they try to illustrate to you. And the main reason here is globalization. is the fact that many companies come into these countries to try to stake labor. That's why it's very popular for many countries to create companies to create jobs or create factories in things like Indonesia, for example. This means that there's active competition between these companies, meaning that they have to make sure that they provide some sort of, rights to these people, labor that's not as bad, and therefore this competition uniquely created by globalization is probably better than the one domestic company that they have on their side, which might be Atani, which is probably going to be more exploitative, and that is why we have better conditions. We better the people's lives on our side of the house. Their second main case here is just to say that wealth does not trickle down. Obviously, a lot of the illustrations that we provide to you obviously prove that trickle down happens through things like infrastructure, through things like job creation, so I think they don't actually respond to our case. But I just want to note that trickle down in many times does happen because the governments have an incentive to make sure this happens because they want to tax these companies and give out money through things like infrastructure, for example. Maybe it's because they're democratically elected, which is like half of the world. Maybe it's because they don't want to be overrun by riots happening on the streets. That's like half of the other world. But I think on either side, how trickle down does happen to some extent. Maybe it's not perfect, but it's better than nothing happening at all. So therefore, on developing countries, we win the debate, which is the obviously most important impact, and therefore it's clear win for side opposition already. But let's engage to their case, which is about the Rust Belt workers in America. I have a few responses here. The first flip here is that they assume that the pie of companies and factories that exist in the world is zero-sum. That's not true. On our side house, there's likely to be significantly more number of things like jobs and things like factories. And the reason is because the market expands on our side house. Maybe on their side house, Ford can only sell to the sellers in America. Now Ford has an entire world to be able to sell to and an entire market that expands. This means that they have to create more cars. They need more factories. They need more workers that work in these factories. So en masse, we probably create more jobs, and therefore it's unclear why it's necessary a zero-sum debate to begin with, right? But before I move on, go ahead.
The agricultural monopoly like Cargill exploits the farmers who originally did carry out farms on their own peacefully. It is wrong that you say you have more choice.
Sadly, monopolization by big agricultural companies probably happens on your side by the regional, like Japanese, what is it? The Japanese farmers trade, for example. On our side, you probably get more competition because of this globalization. That's better on our side house, right? Secondly, companies moving out of America is a win for opposition because our case is far more important than their case on the Rust Belt. Not only because there's just more people that are working in factories outside of America, obviously, but also because there's significantly more safety nets for these people living in America. There's better education, there's better things like social security because these countries are far more democratized, they have far more money to be able to afford these things. Last thing here is that obviously these companies move out slowly. They don't move out the next day because it's expensive to relocate, because they have to create supply chains, newly, for example. This means that there's time for these economies to adapt over time. It happens over a span of 50 years, not over the next day. And therefore these people will be fine. What we save is far more larger numbers of the global poor. We clearly take the debate from opposition.
Thank you for fine speech, opposition with speaker. Now I call upon the opposition reply to give his or her speech within 4 minutes. Here.
I want us to imagine what the worst harms that the proposition was able to prove in this debate actually looks like. Like a homeless person in the US or Germany. What does their life look like? Are they starving? Well, not really. Like government-supplied soup kitchens exist, food drives exist, and in general, for example, beggars on the street get enough money to buy a basic convenience store meal, for example. Are they dying of disease? Well, not really. Like these developed countries have government-mandated health checkups, or at least some form of insurance that exists from employers, which means that you can get reasonable health care on a daily basis. So when we consider what they were able to prove in this debate, maybe these Rust Belt workers are harmed. Maybe we take away their jobs, and maybe they're on the streets homeless. But in comparison to that, what we're able to prove in this debate is the backbreaking extremities that developing country workers have to suffer through. So no matter what beautiful examples the government reply speaker is able to give to you, no matter how great his speech is, I want you to remember that this is the best thing this is the best case scenario for proposition and what they were able to prove. That proposition are fundamentally defending people whose governments are already trying to save them, whose governments are already creating healthcare systems for them. They're in a system where they can vote for a president who says he will help the workers. They're in a country who has the technology to save them, and they're in a location that is safe enough from things like wars and famines that they can survive on a daily basis. So no matter what happens in Gov Reply, no matter how great his speech is, that is what you must consider. Because we are the only side who spends the majority of all of our speech time talking about the people that actually matter in this debate. The people of the developing countries who on a daily basis have to suffer. And their comparative that they push upon us is ideas like, oh, maybe you work on a farm and that's probably better. But I don't think Proposition understands what it's like to work on a farm, when every year your earnings are dependent on the weather, when every day you aren't sure if you have enough food for the next day, and on a daily basis you spend 15-hour work days on farmlands doing grueling, backbreaking work. So for the important clash in developing countries then, what did we prove? We proved that we give choice to these people. Not that we force them to work in like cramped rooms in factories, but rather that if, for example, their farms are unprofitable, if, for example, they're suffering on a daily basis, that there is another path for them in factories, in manual labor. Obviously, their second speaker is very good at pointing out that there is a difference in the negotiating power, which means a lot of these workers are overworked and underpaid. But in comparison to what the alternative world is, in a world without globalism, in a world where these people are confined and trapped to the farmlands that they were born into and shackled to the economies that they were originally in, we think it's better. 1, because we give them choice. 2, because we give them sustainable and stable income. Because as my whip points out, companies don't really leave the original land they came into because of the high cost of doing so, which means they can at least have consistent income rather than being dependent on the weather. 3rd, that the manual labor extremities don't happen. That you probably don't have, for example, 15-hour workdays on the farmland, but rather, even if you work 15 hours, you're at the very least sat in a room. And finally, that corporations, at the very least, you are employed under, which means self-employed farmers who get no protection are screwed, but at least workers in our world, for example, like a factory worker, probably has access to basic water and basic food because the factory obviously doesn't want their workers to die and become unprofitable. So even if they're very good at proving to you all of these benefits that happen to the developed world, and maybe they're also able to prove to you that they somehow benefit the developing world, I want you to consider the choice that we give these people. We empower these people to at the very least say, no, I'm done with this farm work. That yes, I deserve a life, and that is the life we give them. So proud to oppose.
Thank you for fine speech, opposition reply speaker. Now I call upon government reply to end this debate.
The first way in which we win the debate is we prove that there is a substantial harm that globalism has created, because it created a massive loss of jobs and structural unemployment in developed countries. It led to the decline of labor unions that meant that the working class citizens no longer had enough leverage to negotiate for better wages, for example. And there's no real response to this analysis aside from the whip speaker's response, which is that the number of factories overall increases. This is not rebutting our case, because the number of factories, yes, would certainly increase under their side, but most companies chose to move all the factories into Vietnam, into China, and moved away from Japan. So the fact that now the loss of factories happened in Japan is still unrebutted premise that we already explained. This is enough to win the debate, because the wording of the motion is not has done more harm than good, but rather has failed. And specifically, if you consider that there is a massive, substantial side effect to certain phenomena, certain surgery, you consider it a failure, right? when CEO says, my company is going to skyrocket the revenue by 20%, but then you only need 5%. Yes, you increase the revenue, but that's a failure because you failed upon the promise. And they say, you have to define globalism like the God. But I'm not God, I don't know, and they provided no real definition either. So the fact that we provided some definition, and they have no response, means that our claim is true. Secondly, people in developed countries matter more than people in developing countries. And I'm not saying this in an elitist way, genuinely. Firstly, just think about the big benefits, harm that this motion creates. Seiji says, being homeless in UK is nice. Really? Do you think being homeless in Japan or UK is a nice thing? You had families to take care of. You had massive debt because you had to pay for university tuition for your family, for your kids, right? And now your job is absolutely taken away with often very little government assistance because the government is also not that, lucrative at the time. The poor people don't have much political capital, whatever the reason might be, right? Not having a job is really, really traumatizing and really, really hard for you. The first reason why people in developing countries matter more is that think about the types of jobs that we lose and they get. Because the type of job that they get is an undignified job, the exploitative sweatshop type of labor where people are constantly exploited to the max, where human dignity is literally stripped away because of the massive power disparity between people in developing countries versus the multinational corporations. Whereas the type of job that we still have under our side are reasonably well-regulated, functional jobs where people attain some level of happiness through working for a job. Secondly, consider the time frame of the argument that we explained, i.e., under their side of the house, yes, you might temporarily create more jobs in China, but then, what if China economically grows and the wage is higher now? You move out into cheaper countries like Vietnam or Africa. So the job benefit only trickles down to a short time frame, and you create massive, structural unemployment in the long run, which is not a benefit in this debate because you're dependent in your entire life on the factory, but now the factory is gone in 10 years down the line. So, therefore, the people in developed countries are more important actors to care for in this debate. Thirdly, let's assume that whatever happens in developing countries is the most important outcome. Why do you still win the debate? Because there is very little linkage to globalism. Medicine, the concept of medicine, has existed even before globalism. It's not like people didn't have vaccine in developing countries, and the word globalism implies a complete free trade. People still traded, country traded with restrictions, with tariff, but it was tradable. If developing countries wanted and craved for medicine, they could still get it. New argument coming from opposition web, it's choice away from agriculture. This is a new argument from opposition web. Finally, they say competition between multinational companies means that the workers have enough leverage to be able to negotiate for a better job. But the word competition is not a magic blend. They do not explain how the competition manifests between multiple different multinational companies. They do not explain why competition is going to be functional, why it's not the case that the multinational companies all try to take advantage of the poor conditions in developing countries. For all these reasons, in every single metric, we win the debate.
Thank you for your fine speech, Government Reply Speaker. We will now take 1 minute for the audience to deliberate on their verdict for today's debate, after which we will take a vote. Now the 1 minute is over, and I do believe this is a very high-level debate. so it will take some time for some audience members to decide on a side. But without further ado, we will move on to the voting session. Everybody, please settle down. Please raise your hand if you believe side government won today's debate. Thank you, please. Please raise your hand if you believe side opposition won today's debate. Although we do not have a clear number from the way we see it, we believe side government has won today's model debate. Everyone, please give a big round of applause for all of the contenders at today's model debate. Thank you so much.
じゃあなんかちょっと言ってて。感想かわいそう。
ずっと聞いてて最後まで雲行きがわからないほど本当に世界レベルのディベートだったと思いました。本当に先輩方とかも卒業してしまう先輩もたくさんいると思うんですけど、また機会があればぜひやっていただけたらと思います。私も個人的には誠司先輩まではおぽ入りだったんですが、微妙にそのスライドで側に入れてました。はい、以上です。すいません。もう今年で卒業されちゃうお二人に一応お言葉をいただきたいということなんですが、よろしいですか。
お願いし
ます。
皆さん初めましての方しかほぼいないと思うんですけど、土屋奈紗と申します。私Hpdu 来るのが初めてで、こうやって皆さんが集まってこう活気あるディベートの場を見れて非常に嬉しいなっていう、ディベートもすごい楽しかったなっていう感じです。で多分これから試合が待ってると思うんですけど、実力発揮できるように緊張せず、相手に負けると思ったら負けるんで、勝てると、どんな相手でも自分が勝っていると思って戦うことが大事だと思います。皆さんこれからもディベート頑張ってください。ありがとうございました。
はい、吉田幸太郎と申します。僕も多分初めましての方の方が多いと思うんですけど、なんでしょうね、僕が Hpdu 参加したのは2020年と2021年、はい、なので5、6年前ですね。2連覇。そうです、2連覇しました。自慢です。はい。なんか結構僕がディベートする中で上達したって感じた地点は、今まではすごいなんか論理とかロジックを詰めようみたいな意識ばっかりあって、じゃあこの話をしたくてこの理由を詰めていこうみたいな、なんか論理にとらわれてたんですけど、人って論理には説得されないんですよ。説得されるのは直感とかいかに分かりやすいかなんで、ぜひですね、皆さん明日4試合あるので、1試合目は正直勝っても負けても関係ないんで、ぜひね、自分の中でもし今までロジックばっかりだっていう人がいればね、ちょっと新しいスピーチスタイルを試していただきたいかなというふうに思います。はい。あとね、一応、今回僕はモーション作成に携わらせていただいて、一応全部モーションは作ってはあるので、変なモーションはないとは思いますが、もしですね、すごいクレームがあるようでしたら、僕の方にですね、お声掛けください。以上です。ありがとうございました。
皆様、この Hpdu の小野と申します。ちょっとメンバーがちょっと今回ガチすぎてですね、モデルディベートというか普通に試合をしたみたいな、大会の決勝で普通に本気でやったみたいな感じなんで、逆に去年まではちょっと割とこうモデルディベートっぽい感じでジョークと楽しくゆっくりしゃべるみたいなで、今回ちょっと全員ちょっとガチめな感じでやってたんで、それはそれで良かったかなみたいなね、大人本気出すとこんな感じかみたいな。だってね、NASA さんも吉田幸太郎さんも世界大会クォーターファイナルで、日本史上最強記録なんで、戦後一番強いディベーターなわけじゃないですか。で、戦前も含めて、日本建国以来2000年で多分一番強いわけじゃないですか。 でだってオックスフォード IB でも優勝してるってことは、中国に行って卓球の大会で優勝するみたいなことなんで、ディベートオックスフォード大学発祥なんで、パーラメンタリーディベートとかで本番に乗り込んで優勝してるわけなんで、それってすさまじいこと、日本人がここまでのレベルてかこれ以上 いないので、この国には。なのでこの国にはいないこれ以上いない人の本気のスピーチを生で見れたのは非常に後で思い返してもレジェンドな出来事だと思うんで、ちょっといい宝物を提供できてよかったなって思ってます。で、僕自分のスピーチ終わってからもじっくり聞いてたんですよ。この2人がどんなスピーチをするのかっていうのを、自分がいるラウンドでどんなスピーチをするのかっていうのがすごい気になって、音源は聞いたことあるんですよね、2人の。でやっぱりね、思ったのが3つあって、1つが聞く力がめちゃくちゃすごくて、もう相手の議論をくまなくじっくり聞いて理解してるんですよね。で試合中とか、あと普通の時も人の話ってみんなあんまり聞かないんですよ。でなんか世間ではディベートはこう論破だと誤解されてて、とりあえず自分のことを声高に主張すればいいって思ってるんですけど、一番強い人はやっぱ聞く力がえげつなく強くて、多分喋ってる本人よりも理解してる時があるみたいな。僕の喋ってるアーギュメントを僕以上に理解してる感じがするんですよね、リフュードとか聞いてても。あ、そういうこと言いたかった俺ってなるんですよ。だから相手が喋ってんのにめっちゃうなずいちゃうみたいな、そうそれみたいな、なんかすごいそれは気持ちいいことだし、議論が深まりますよね。なんか適当に聞いてリスポンスよりめっちゃじっくり聞いてリスポンスした方が、そのなんか聞く力のえぐさを感じましたっていうのと、2つ目にやっぱりイラストレーション力とか具体的に描写する力が強いですね。さっきのイントゥイッションとか直感に訴えかけるロジックじゃないスピーチ、結構頭にパッと目に浮かぶんですよね。そのグローバライゼーションじゃなかった世界でめちゃくちゃ暑い中農業やってる人 VS パナソニックの工場でなんとか働けてる人とか、デトロイトで仕事を失った40代のおじいちゃんみたいな話もしたと思うんですけど、やっぱこうイラストする力、ロジックに1秒足すだけでいいんで、5秒10秒だけで全然変わりますよね。それでパッと頭に浮かぶみたいな。で最後が比較をめっちゃするんですよね。皆さん多分スピーチの 3,40% は比較に割いてた気して、こっちでこうなります、だけどこっちじゃこうなりません、この観点だとこっちで大事ですみたいな、こうずーっとコンパラティブなんで話が。なんで聞いててなんか隙がないというか穴がないなと、審査員だったとしても、穴がないから結構ハイスコアつけないなみたいな感じのスピーチがしてたんで、聞く力、イラスト、比較みたいなところは、明日からチャレンジできるかなと思うんで頑張ってください。はい、
ありがとうございました。今お話ししてたようにね、今年のみんなはすごいラッキー。こんな試合は本当に世の中に見れないからね、素晴らしいと思います。ありがとうございます。じゃあそれについてさらに。
はい、ちょうどじゃあ事務連絡のちょっと入るんですけども、ここの今のお二人ですね、本当みんなラッキーなので、日本最強のディベーター歴史上のお二人がいまして、で明日その特別企画ということで、こちらディベートフォージャパンの方で明日ワークショップやりますので、2つ話します。1個はメンタリティってことで、世界に出ていく時の気持ちの部分、メンタルをどうやるかっていうのを対談しながら話して、でその後もっと多分みんなが知りたい世界に出ていくための練習方法とか、そういう具体的な話の2部構成でやっていきたいと思いますので、これ見学の方は全然 OK としていますし、あとあれですね、オンラインで Zoom でもやるんで、もし明日来れなかったら Zoom で、もう無理だな、今日申し込みまだ大丈夫、Zoom でやりますので、超めちゃくちゃ貴重な機会で、もうお二人は大学院生卒業してもうディベート界戻ってきてほしいですけど、なかなか忙しくなっちゃうと思うので、そう皆さん超ラッキーな年なので、そこでちょっとそういう話をできたらなっていうのがまず一つです。それから2日目ごめんないんですけど、今日ディベートやってくれたひろこ、せいじ、ナッキー、あともう一人カンタロウっていう生徒なんですけど、全員チームジャパンなんですけど、去年のね、そのメンバーがこの3日目にワークショップでちょっと説明しようか。
どんなプレー？
私と石田貫太郎は初心者と基礎編のワークショップを行います。でここは主にコンストラクティブスピーカーだからファーストスピーカーとか、あとはその2番目のスピーカーでやっぱり立論立てたいなっていう人のなんかアーギュメントのうまい立て方とか、そのプレパの仕方とか、あとはその反論のうまいそのはめ込み方とかを発表していくので、ぜひファーストスピーカーとか来てください。お願いします。
僕と茂木君は、中級者上級者向けに、反論やウェイイングについて話させていただきたいと思います。今日のラウンドでもちょっとあったような反論とウェイイングについて話すんですけど、初心者の方からある程度聞きやすいような内容にはなっていると思うので、ぜひ来ていただきたいです。で昨年度も同じトピックでレクチャーやらせていただいたんですけど、 相当改良はしているので、昨年度聞いた方でも面白いようになっているつもりです。であとエグザンプルは全部この予選の4試合のラウンドをエグザンプルにさせていただくので、そのラウンドの振り返りにもなると思います。よろしくお願いします。
本当に
1個だけちょっと補足していいですか。すごいみんな謙虚なんであんまり言わないんですけど、大学生の歴史も変えましたけど、この4人、今では3人ですけど、高校生の世界大会で予選12位で、これも過去史上最高のメンバーなので、それもめちゃくちゃラッキーなので、そのワークショップを受けられるっていうのもラッキーですので、ぜひ楽しんでください。準決勝行けた人は残念ながら見れないんですけど、それ以外の方々見れますので、ぜひ楽しんでください。
そうね、3日目はそうなんですよ。普通だったら負けたらつまんないから帰っちゃうかなとか、東京見学とかと思うかもしれないんですけど、それどころじゃないんですよ。負けてよかったかなぐらいのね、ワークショップを受けられるんで、勝ったら勝ったで嬉しいけど、いや本当にそうなんで、
そう歴史を変えたメンバーが、
そうですね、歴史を変えたっていうのは本当にそうです。あとは、近隣電車で、来れるよっていう後輩とかがいたら、夜になっちゃうからねあれなんですけども、でもこの昼は行けるか。
ワークショップは3日目は昼です。
なんか良さそうだぞと、宣伝してこなかったけど呼びたくなった、学校さんはぜひ呼んでください、ね、当然無料で入れます。受付をちゃんとしてれば大丈夫なんで呼んでみてください、はい、
じゃあ、この企画のモデルディベート終わり